watching Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Julia Kim. These are the headlines on the continent. 4 people have died in Senegal's worst unrest in years. Those clashes sparked by the arrest of opposition leader Ousmane Sonko. Kenya launches its vaccination campaign. Countries across the continent are urging for vaccine fairness in the fight against the pandemic. And as Ivory Coast's opposition eyes a comeback in Saturday's legislative elections, our guest tonight tells us more about whether the country can hope for national reconciliation anytime soon. But first, Senegalese opposition leader Ousmane Sonko is being held in custody after his arrest on Wednesday. Clashes between his supporters and the police rocked the capital and killed 4 people, according to the Interior Ministry. Sonko faces multiple charges, including alleged rape and disturbing the public order. A key challenger to President Macky Sall, he says the accusations against him are an attempt to remove him from standing in 2024's elections. Jean-Emile Jamin has more.
Skirmishes return to the streets of Dakar as Friday marks the 3rd successive day of protests in Senegal's capital, following the arrest of the country's opposition leader, Ousmane Sonko. New restrictions by government on internet access, not enough to quell the dissent. On Thursday, chaos had erupted as clashes broke out between Senegalese police and university students. And by late evening, the violence reached a climax, leading to the first protester death since the dissent began. Sonko was arrested on Wednesday after hundreds of his supporters clashed with police, protesting a rape accusation made against him, which he denies. As the leader of the opposition Pastef party and largely popular among the youth, Ousmane Sonko is seen as the strongest challenger to President Macky Sall ahead of the 2024 elections. Sonko's lawyers believe there is a conspiracy in play to have him silenced.
Son arrestation et sa conduite à la section de recherche avaient uniquement pour but de faire en sorte qu'on puisse le déférer. Donc maintenant, il est clair que l'état de droit a cédé la place à un état répressif.
Despite an increasing reputation as a stable democracy, Senegal hasn't seen violence flare up like this in years. Amnesty International also recently expressed concerns about what it claims to be a series of arbitrary arrests amidst a crackdown where 2 private television channels were suspended for 3 days following coverage of the demonstrations.
Well, so at least 4 people now dead in Senegal, according to its Interior Ministry. Meanwhile, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres has also weighed in, urging all sides in Senegal to avoid any further escalation of violence. Now, another opposition leader is behind bars, this time in Benin. Rekia Madugu was arrested 2 days ago for suspected links to a terrorism case. Rights groups are demanding her immediate release and say her arrest was politically motivated. She was also recently barred from running in April's presidential election by the Electoral Commission. The opposition says this is part of President Patrice Talon's crackdown on opponents ahead of the ballot. Let's hear from Madugu's lawyer and Benin's government on her detention.
Elle est accusée curieusement par une personne avec qui elle n'a jamais échangé, qu'elle n'a jamais vue. C'est ceux qui la combattent au plan politique, c'est à ces derniers que profite cette arrestation-là.
Il y a des soupçons, il y a des indices concordants, des faits matériels et des aveux, la reine des preuves, de conspiration d'un crime qui est en train de sourdir d'actes terroristes. Donc nous sommes dans une phase d'enquête où les autorités ont besoin d'interroger les uns et les autres.
Well, turning now to Somalia, where at least 10 people have been killed in an attack in the capital, Mogadishu. Police say a rickshaw loaded with explosives was detonated at a popular restaurant. At least 1 building nearby collapsed after the blast. 30 others were injured, and that toll is expected to rise. Al-Shabaab militants have claimed responsibility for the attack. Kenya has launched its much-delayed COVID vaccination campaign. 1 million AstraZeneca doses finally arrived this week, funded by the global COVAX scheme. One of its goals is to vaccinate a 1/5 of the continent, but that's still not enough to achieve so-called herd immunity. So far, just a handful of rich nations have used 3/4 of all vaccines. Kenya's president has urged for vaccine fairness, saying no single country will be safe unless all of us are safe. Laurent Berstecker reports.
A first jab and a collective sigh of relief. Doctors and nurses at Nairobi's Kenyatta Hospital were eagerly awaiting their turn as Kenya kicked off its vaccination campaign on Friday.
It's important because they come across many people, and by the time you discover someone is suffering from COVID, it will be too late.
On Wednesday, Kenya received 1 million doses of the AstraZeneca jab. The shipment was sent by the global COVAX initiative, which seeks to ensure low and middle-income countries have access to vaccines. The initiative, which is jointly financed by the US, the EU, the World Health Organization, and other NGOs, aims to inoculate 20% of the population in nearly 200 countries. And despite a slow start to the rollout, partially caused by a global shortage of vaccines, Kenyan authorities remained optimistic that COVAX would be able to meet its targets.
Our indicative allocation under the COVAX platform was 4.2 million. We only received 1 million doses. And we hope that the target is not cast in stone. It will change as international manufacturing improves.
Under phase 1 of Kenya's vaccination campaign, the country hopes to inoculate some 400,000 medical and frontline workers. Phase 2, which is expected to start in the summer and last an entire year, will focus on the vulnerable and the elderly. And phase 3, which will kick off in June 2022, will open up vaccination to the rest of Kenya's population.
Now, the World Health Organization says there's a very high risk of an Ebola outbreak spreading from Guinea to its neighbors. 18 cases have been identified in the country. 4 of them have died. It's the first resurgence of the virus since the outbreak there in 2013 to 16, which killed thousands of people across West Africa. Recently, some 1,600 people in Guinea have been vaccinated against Ebola. The WHO says some neighboring countries, though, are not prepared for a new outbreak nor for future vaccination campaigns. Ivory Coast is holding legislative elections this Saturday, with Alassane Ouattara's party fending off a challenge by 2 opposition parties led by former presidents. It's the first election in 10 years in which all major opposition players are taking part. This will also be Ouattara's first test since being re-elected in a landslide last year. The violence that followed, though, left over 80 people dead and the country deeply divided. Earlier, we spoke to Jessica Moody from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. I started by asking her how decisive an issue national reconciliation will be in Saturday's vote.
Ivorians have been waiting a long time for reconciliation. It's something that politicians have been promising them basically since war first broke out in 2002. I think that actually they've heard the promise of reconciliation too many times, and it's quite likely that in this election they won't see the promise of reconciliation as being particularly decisive because they've lost hope that this is something to believe in.
Now, there are some citizens, of course, that say that only a facade of peace has been established and that, as you were saying, reconciliation and reintegration remain unfinished business. How volatile is the situation there right now? How easily could things degenerate into an all-out war?
I think before the election in October 2020, there was a real danger of the kind of leftover issues of the conflict between 2002 and 2011 sparking further violence. And obviously we did see some violence during the electoral campaign then. But I think now the situation is a lot calmer. Ouattara has a greater grip over the armed forces and over the country as a whole. And I think actually the risk of serious violence coming about now is much diminished.
Now, in your recent paper, you talked about 2 kinds of reconciliation programs. There's the DDR, the demobilization, dismantlement and reintegration versus transnational justice. Could you explain a bit more about what those 2 approaches are?
So DDR looks at the demobilization, disarmament and reintegration of ex-combatants at the end of conflict. So try to kind of find new jobs and new livelihoods for former combatants to prevent them from causing a resurgence of conflict. whereas transitional justice looks more at the kind of processes of healing in the aftermath of conflict, so looking to undertake truth commissions or prosecutions and heal from the loss and the trauma of conflict and come to terms with the events.
And in your opinion, what would be the best approach for Ivory Coast?
I think at the moment the greatest obstacle to reconciliation is really the absence of political will from the political parties involved. I think it's a really positive sign that obviously you've got more political parties partaking in this election than has been the case for many years, and so that indicates a greater buy-in for a process of reconciliation perhaps. But really the obstacle is kind of the government itself and its unwillingness to redistribute power equally between different political parties and ethnic groups. So I think that's really the major issue here, and that needs to be addressed before we can move towards reconciliation.
And there are pundits that are predicting a record low turnout for tomorrow's legislative elections. What could a lack of participation do for the country's hopes for reconciliation in the future?
I think that's really indicative of the kind of lack of hope among people partaking in this election that this is going to lead to reconciliation. I think people have kind of lost hope in the political process as a means of forming reconciliation and for their voices to be heard through that process. I think people have seen their parties boycott elections repeatedly because of the unjust political process. And I think there's a sense that they're not going to get anywhere through voting at the ballot box, and that change has to come from above really before that they can do anything about it through voting themselves.
And of course, we'll be covering those elections for you in Ivory Coast right here on France 24. There's more news up next. Stay tuned.